Let's talk now about the story that you're here to talk about today, which is, of course, the infected blood scandal that we have been reporting on this programme this morning. For the first time in more than 40 years, the government has accepted liability in that scandal. And we've heard, haven't we, that there's going to be an interim compensation payment for victims of that of £100,000 each. I mean, this news obviously has been widely welcomed. Does it go far enough?
Well, look, it's worth remembering that these are interim payments. From the government's point of view, what became clear from the inquiry which was started by the government in 2017, following, frankly, too long a campaign. I mean, a really fantastic campaign, but one that had to last too long, unfortunately, to get that inquiry. What became clear in the early stages was that compensation was going to have to be paid and that there was an urgent requirement for that. So my predecessors commissioned this report into the framework for compensation payments. That has recommended an interim payment reflecting the fact that sadly people are dying from the impact of this awful scandal on far too regularly, and that we needed to get money to them quickly. So I'm very pleased that, as you say, we're able to start to make those interim payments from today, with a deadline of having them paid by the end of October to those who are infected and to bereaved partners.
OK, so let's pick up on that for a moment, because you're talking about who is eligible: survivors and bereaved partners. Now, the inquiry actually recommended children, siblings and parents of those who had died too. What can you say to them?
So that's not actually correct. So what the inquiry said to us was that we should make swift payments to those who are infected and to bereaved partners, because they're already registered to a support scheme, and that allows us to make the payments quickly. Wider eligibility is more complicated, and while that will be considered as part of the inquiry, and that inquiry will conclude next year, that we weren't able to make payments quickly to those people for the reasons of complexity now. But as I say, it's worth remembering that these are interim payments, and that when the inquiry concludes, we'll be able to give further consideration to what it's telling us then. For the moment, we're complying 100% with what Sir Brian Langstaff has recommended in his interim report, but obviously the final report will give us more to do.
So we've heard this morning a story of a 95-year-old woman who lost both of her sons because of infected blood. She receives nothing. What would you say to her? What's coming down the line for her?
Well, obviously there are far too many terrible, awful, tragic stories. As part of this inquiry, I've read, the testimony of some of the people who've been impacted by this dreadful scandal, and it really is heartbreaking what's happened. And people have our deepest sympathy for what's impacted on their lives in these dreadful ways. But as I say, the inquiry, which is being conducted with commendable speed by Sir Brian Langstaff, will conclude next year. When it does conclude, we'll be able to make some further, do some further work on these complex issues of eligibility and decide where we go next. For the moment, though, we are, as I say, complying with his recommendation that we make these interim payments of £100,000, and I hope for at least those people who are receiving them, that is a modicum of good news.
One of the things I know that they have been asking for is a formal apology. When will that come?
Well, obviously the inquiry will conclude next year, as I say, and that inquiry is looking not just at compensation or impact on people's lives, but the whole path of this tragedy from its inception back in the 1970s, how it was dealt with by the health service, how it was dealt with by government, frankly, and has obviously taken testimony from government as well. And then once it concludes, we'll be able to draw some conclusions from it, and there'll obviously be some work for us to do about further eligibility, and no doubt, litigation or others will ensue from it. But the key thing today, I think, is to recognise that there's an urgency about these interim payments. We want to get them out as fast as we possibly can. We have a group who are eligible, who are already on a support scheme, and our undertaking today is that the money will flow to them as fast as we can get it out the door.
And campaigners say there are potentially tens of thousands of people who are eligible who have not yet come forward. They might not even know they're eligible. How are you going to reach them, and how are you going to find them?
Well, one of the things that the inquiry is looking at is the scope and the impact to try and estimate how many people were affected by this awful tragedy. And obviously, once we see that, we'll be able to do further work. For the moment, as I say, we have a body of people who are registered on the support scheme. It is possible for people to come forward and register. There are eligibility criteria for them to come on the scheme. And Sir Brian has recommended that these interim payments are made to those who do register on the scheme subsequently between now and effectively the inception of a wider compensation scheme. And so for those who do think that they've been affected, I would encourage them to come in forward and apply for eligibility.
But what about children or parents? What would you say to them now? What should they do?
Well, as I say, Sir Brian acknowledged in his remarks around the recommendations that were made to us that this would be disappointing to those who weren't bereaved partners, but whose eligibility was more complicated, if you like. But as I say, I would just emphasise that these payments are interim payments. We have now a framework, thanks to the report of Sir Robert Francis, around the payment of future compensation, and as the inquiry comes to a close and reaches its conclusion, we'll be able to do further work to put that in place.
Kit Malthouse, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, thank you.